Several years ago in 2004, I think even before this, Heritage Institute, Cato Institute, I don't know where I read it exactly, but the average government employee salary, the average salary of somebody that worked for the government was $47,000 a year, and the average salary for somebody in the private sector was about $37,000 a year. And so, just in terms of the existing strategy of steadily and incrementally taking away our individual freedom, if most people work for the government, then that strategy is going to be successful, and that's been the strategy for well over 100 years. So we have to ask ourselves, how successfully have they taken away our individual freedom in this country? And you'd have to conclude that they've done a pretty thorough job of it, that the only thing that they haven't really succeeded at taking away from us is our gun rights. And obviously they're employing the children to try to say, you've got to relinquish your gun rights for the children now. And, if they are able to do that, then there's literally no reason why we can't experience something very, very close to Nazi Germany in this country, where you don't have a gun, or you don't have adequate ammunition, or the gun culture has been defeated enough for you to have not practiced enough to be any good with your firearm. And the government agents, of course, have lots of guns, always will. That's definitional, to government agencies, is that they have the ability to project force. And so we're pretty close to being unable to defend ourselves in this country. In most of the states, in Alaska, you've got a few holdout people, you've got something of a gun culture there. But by and large, the people are relinquishing all of their rights. And so maybe this latest push to have the children take away our final means of defense when there's a knock at the door, then we'll have no ability to defend ourselves. We'll have nothing to say about it. We'll have to get on the truck or be shot while resisting right there. And that's the ultimate kind of society that all totalitarians really desire. They would really love it if that was the kind of society that we live in, because we have ceded power to them. And so, language becomes very important, because language is the means of uniting people who might want to avoid that kind of a future. And not just freedom of speech, but actually the language itself, the terms themselves. Just to kind of clarify my position here, right and left are increasingly both totalitarian in this country. And so there's oftentimes an argument between fascism and socialism, right? And people on the left will criticize fascism, and people on the right will criticize socialism, and they'll both think that the criticisms of their side and the typical label that is associated with fascist forms of both right and left doesn't apply to them, when in fact it actually applies to both of them. And so being closer to right or left is an illegitimate position, okay, in the way that right and left are currently construed in this country. But there is a legitimate historical version of leftism, or liberalism, and that's what it was called, just liberalism. And now, to differentiate that from socialism, people call that classical liberalism. And it's a mistake to call it classical liberalism, because the entire reason that you wouldn't just call it libertarianism is because you don't want to break that historical thread, and the historical thread strikes most people in this country still as legitimate. So it's very intelligent to call yourself a liberal and then say classical liberal, yes, but I'll just call myself a liberal, because why should I cede that word over to socialists? Why should I surrender that word to them when they have no right to it? They have nothing in common with classical liberal positions. They don't believe in individual freedom, for example. They don't believe that there should be any hard and fast limits on state power. And then, of course, the people on the right who wish to conserve whatever is currently in existence, Well, that's an incredible mistake, right? Because then you're conserving all of the socialism along with any sort of limits on government power that you might mistakenly think still exist. Now, there are some limits on government power, but there are no legal limits on government power left that are still effective. And so let me clarify what I mean there, because once again, all of the language currently being used on so-called both sides of the debate, really many sides of the debate, and it's all illegitimate. So legally, you can write down a limit on government power on a piece of paper, and then slowly sociopaths will figure out a way to not be bound by that limit. And this has already happened. This has already completely happened. There are no more hard and fast limits on government power. What happens is that judges and prosecutors pay close attention to how much defendants pay to bar licensed attorneys in court. And they pay that money, they pay close attention to how much money has been spent to the bar licensed defense attorneys. And then they occasionally, if there's any outcry, or if the person is wealthy and they signal wealth and power, to that defense attorney, then sometimes they will side with the defendant. And they will generally not side with the defendant if the defendant is going against the status quo. If they're really trying to set a positive precedent in favor of defending individual freedom, generally so-called leftist judges, and so-called rightist judges or conservative judges, none of it means anything when you're talking about the people who have sought out political power, because those are the people that are creating the problem in the first place. Those are the kinds of people. They are literally sociopaths. They are literally without conscience. They literally do not care if your 20-year-old son is perfectly innocent, has not initiated force against anyone else, if the alleged offense he's charged with is if there's no injury and no intent in the offense, and therefore there's no corpus in the offense. That's what they mean when they say habeas corpus, that there has to be what's called a corpus delicti, or a body of the crime, in every offense. Otherwise the jury is supposed to find them not guilty. And the judge and prosecutor don't care if this is the case. They just take the view that every single law created by any legislature anywhere is legitimate, and enforce it to the maximum. And that's of course just a tyranny of the majority. That's what our current system of the government is just a tyranny of the majority. So so don't call yourself right or left. Take a look at the Nolan chart online. Google Nolan chart. That's a legitimate political spectrum, okay? And the further you support individual freedoms that the right typically supports, economic freedoms that they allegedly claim to support, the further up the further along the x-axis you move, and the more social tolerance or individual freedom on as far as personal privacy goes and social tolerance issues, the further up the y-axis you move. And so then ideally you reach a point far from zero on the x and y axis, and then if you were to connect that line through the 0 point on both, the 0 point would be total lack of individual freedom in the economic direction and in the social tolerance direction. So that would be both right and left forms of totalitarianism or tyranny. And then the further away that you get, you might wind up closer to left or closer to right, but the further away from that 0 point that you get, the more you could be called libertarian or classical liberal. And that would be a position that's worth striving for in terms of the way that the law is enforced, the way that the law is applied. And that's the way that kind of a law, or a system of law, a system of legal theory would be enforced, would be to only prosecute actions that have both injury and intent to injure another innocent human being. And then if the law does not criminalize actions that inherently have both injury and intent to injure another human being, the jury should return a not guilty verdict and nullify the law, or exercise jury independence by nullifying the law.